The seven suns of harmonious alignment cast prismatic light across the grand observatory's crystal dome. High Chancellor Vex Moore adjusted his ceremonial mantle, the weight of 3 centuries' leadership of the collective heavy upon his shoulders. The celestial convergence occurred once every 94 cycles, a cosmic event most beings witnessed only twice in their lifetimes. Magnificent, is it not? Chief Astronomer Tizzy whispered, her translucent skin reflecting the spectrum of colors only this alignment could produce. Indeed, the calculations to predict this alignment were among the first great achievements of our unified sciences, Vex Moore replied, allowing himself a moment of pride. The collective had maintained peace across 130,000 worlds for longer than most species had existed. Their technological supremacy was unquestioned. Their societal harmony envied throughout the 3 spiral arms they governed. Perfection, achieved through careful biological optimization and environmental control, had created an unparalleled civilization. His neural implant chirped, a minor annoyance. Protocol required all communications silenced during the convergence ceremony. He sent a dismissal thought, but it chirped again, then screamed directly into his cerebral cortex with a priority override that hadn't been activated in 217 years. Vex Moore staggered, his 4 primary limbs instinctively bracing against the observatory floor. Around him, other officials with equivalent security clearance similarly recoiled as their implants delivered the impossible alert. Perimeter breach, unknown vessel, quantum barrier network compromised, sectors 12 to 87. Containment protocols failing. The inevitable consequence. A sentinel vessel whose existence was classified above even Vex Moore's considerable clearance had gone silent after approaching the intruder. 17 defensive arrays had activated automatically. 12 had already failed. Chancellor, the ceremony is suspended, announced Security Director Zivtal, already activating his command interface. The neural connection flooded Vex Moore's consciousness with tactical data. The barrier network, impenetrable for 5 millennia, hadn't merely been breached. Sections had been completely ignored, as if they weren't there. The observatory's central holographic display, meant to showcase the sun's alignment, flickered and reconfigured to emergency protocols. The assembled dignitaries, representatives from every major collective world, gasped collectively as the image resolved. A vessel, small by collective standards, asymmetrical, composed of materials so crude that several council members scoffed audibly. But it was there, inside their most secure perimeter, somehow still intact despite passing through radiation fields that should have reduced any known alloy to atomic particles. Magnify grid section 9, Vex Moore commanded. The image zoomed to show a transparent section of the vessel. Inside, bipedal entities moved with casual indifference to their situation. One raised a container to its facial orifice, consuming something while gesturing animatedly to its companions. "They're eating," Tizzy whispered in disbelief. During first contact, another counselor added, appalled. "Scans indicate consumption of substances our systems classify as toxic," the AI interface reported. "Biochemical analysis suggests compounds that would be lethal to 17 known sentient species." More disturbing was what came next. The vessel's external sensors were broadcasting an oscillating pattern of sounds. The AI translated it through the observatory's acoustic system, and rhythmic vibrations filled the chamber. "Is that a form of communication?" asked Counselor Pax. "Negative," the AI responded. "Pattern analysis suggests recreational auditory stimulation. They call it music." The Sentinel vessel's final transmission appeared on Vex Moore's private feed. It had attempted to establish a containment field around the intruder, standard procedure, but something had gone catastrophically wrong when the fields intersected. The human vessel was venting heat directly into space, a violation of thermodynamic efficiency laws that the collective had overcome millennia ago. The interaction between that impossible heat exchange and the collective's containment field had created a cascade failure through the Sentinel's primary systems. "Deploy the 7th Fleet from standby," Vexmore ordered, the convergence forgotten, and established direct communication. As the collective's most advanced ships converged on the intruder, Vexmore studied the bizarre creatures who had so casually appended 5,000 years of security doctrine. They were smiling. Captain Alina Reyes had experienced many unusual situations during her 15 years with the United Earth Exploration Corps. None prepared her for imprisonment in what appeared to be a perfectly spherical chamber with no visible entrance, walls that shimmered with opalescent patterns, and gravity precisely calibrated to Earth normal, which was somehow more unsettling than if they'd gotten it wrong. "Hello," she called, for perhaps the 20th time. "I believe we've established that we perceive sound waves in similar frequency ranges. Communication would benefit both our species." A panel of the iridescent wall darkened, forming a circular viewport. Beyond it, a being observed her. Its body appeared segmented into 3 distinct regions, each with specialized limb clusters. The head, if that was the upper section, contained 7 evenly spaced visual organs arranged in a circular pattern. "Ion Security Director Zivtal," came a voice that seemed to emanate from the air itself. The translation was surprisingly fluent, with only slight delays between thoughts. "You have violated 83 separate collective security protocols, the least of which would typically result in molecular dispersal." Reyes maintained her diplomatic posture. "We had no knowledge of your protocols or even your existence until our ship was forcibly detained. I am Captain Alina Reyes of the UEC Pathfinder, representing Earth and human colonies. We are an exploratory vessel on a peaceful mission." Peaceful? The alien's visual organs contracted simultaneously. "Your vessel's thermal emissions destabilized an entire containment grid. Your body chemistry is classified as a Class 3 biohazard in 23 separate categories. The substance you call blood would corrode standard collective alloys." Reyes suppressed a smile. Of all the first contact scenarios they'd trained for, being biologically intimidating hadn't made the list. "These are natural features of human biology, not weapons," she explained. "If you'd allow me to speak with my crew." "Your engineer has already breached his containment cell," Zivtal interrupted. "Twice." Lieutenant Commander Jackson had indeed escaped his initial holding cell within 15 minutes of confinement. The food dispensing mechanism had proven troublingly simple to disassemble, its components remarkably similar to standard quantum entanglement communicators. The collective subsequently transferred him to a more secure chamber with no mechanical elements whatsoever. It had taken him 35 minutes to escape that one. "Fascinating distributed processing architecture," he muttered, examining the crystalline node he'd extracted from the chamber wall. The aliens had made the classic mistake of assuming that because a system lacked moving parts, it couldn't be manipulated. But quantum systems still required information pathways, and those could be interrupted with precisely applied pressure. Through the improvised communication device he'd assembled, Jackson heard Dr. Park's voice. "Jackson, are you monitoring this data stream? Their entire security network is running on what looks like a variation of Schrödinger-Walsh quantum encryption. We abandoned that approach decades ago because of the recursive vulnerability in adjacent quantum states. Can you exploit it?" "Already am." Park's voice contained the familiar excitement that typically preceded either a breakthrough or a court-martial. "Their systems are remarkably advanced, but developed along completely different evolutionary principles. They prioritized perfect prediction over adaptability. It's like they built a masterpiece mansion, but forgot to include doors." Alarms suddenly blared throughout the detention block. "That would be my fault," Park admitted. "I was just trying to access their species classification database, but apparently made some improvements to the routing algorithms in the process. These systems are so inefficient it's almost physically painful to interact with them." Jackson froze as a panel slid open in his cell wall. Instead of security forces, he saw a service drone hovering uncertainly. "Did you just hack their security systems?" "Not intentionally," Park replied. "I was merely correcting cascading logic errors in their primary routing protocols. It's like seeing someone doing advanced calculus while still making basic arithmetic errors. The service drone projected a holographic message, a complete schematic of the detention facility. "They're keeping the captain in central containment," Jackson observed. "And I think I figured out why they're so afraid of us. Look at the atmospheric composition they're maintaining in the corridors. 30% reduced oxygen levels, trace element scrubbers, radiation dampening fields." Park's voice trailed off in realization. "They think we're biological weapons." Outside Jackson's cell, alarms continued to escalate as more systems inexplicably began optimizing themselves, spreading Dr. Park's corrections like a digital contagion through networks that had never needed to evolve immunity to human ingenuity. The Grand Council chamber of the Collective had never hosted a species quite like humans before. Its architecture, designed to accommodate 34 distinct morphologies from gas-phase sentience to silicon lattice intelligences, had been hastily modified with additional containment fields to manage what the xenobiologists were now classifying as extreme biological volatility. Captain Rice stood on the central platform, surrounded by a barely visible shimmer of quarantine energy. She had requested appropriate diplomatic attire, and the Collective had synthesized what their database suggested was formal human clothing, a slightly outdated but serviceable dress uniform. What they hadn't anticipated was her request for coffee. "I assure you this substance is not a weapon or drug," Rice explained to the increasingly agitated council as a service drone delivered a steaming cup of the synthesized beverage. "It's a traditional element of human diplomatic encounters, a sign of goodwill and clear minds." High Chancellor Vexmore studied the molecular breakdown on his neural feed with growing concern. The substance contained multiple stimulants, bitter alkaloids, and what appeared to be mild toxins. The fact that humans consumed this voluntarily only reinforced his species classification report. "Proceed," he authorized reluctantly, "but be advised that any adverse reaction will trigger automatic security protocols." Rice accepted the cup, inhaled the aroma with visible pleasure, and took a careful sip. The warmth and familiar bitterness centered her, a small touch of humanity in this utterly alien environment. Then she sighed with satisfaction. It was an unconscious, entirely human gesture, the small exhalation of pleasure after that first sip of good coffee. To Rice, it meant nothing. To the Collective's hypervigilant biological monitoring systems, it was catastrophic. Alarms shrieked throughout the chamber as atmospheric contamination warnings flooded every neural feed. The microscopic water droplets from Rice's breath, carrying human oral bacteria, skin cells, and trace respiratory elements, dispersed into the council chamber's carefully filtered air. "Containment breach," shouted the chief xenobiologist, his sensory appendages flaring in panic. "Multiple unknown biological agents detected." 3 council members collapsed immediately, their neural systems overwhelmed by emergency signals. Medical drones swarmed from recessed chambers. The view screens surrounding the platform displayed microscopic imagery of human microbiota now present in the chamber, hundreds of species of bacteria and microorganisms that lived symbiotically within and upon the human body. "Quarantine protocols at maximum," announced the facility AI, detecting rapid adaptation of foreign microorganisms to local environment. Vexmore remained standing, though his secondary limbs trembled visibly. "Captain Rice, your body contains multiple independent ecosystems of alien life forms. Explain immediately." Rice blinked in confusion. "You mean my microbiome? The bacteria that live in my digestive system and on my skin. They're harmless symbionts. Every human carries them. You knowingly transport trillions of foreign organisms within your own body, and they assist you." The council's senior geneticist pushed forward despite the panic. "Of course, they help us digest food, protect against harmful pathogens, synthesize certain vitamins." "You've weaponized your own evolution," interrupted Councillor Mektora, the only remaining member of the Biological Security Committee still conscious. "Your species doesn't just adapt to environments. You incorporate other life forms to accelerate the process. The screens now showed real-time imagery of human-derived bacteria, already beginning to adapt to the chamber's alien environment, modifying their structures to utilize available resources despite the containment fields. "Emergency vote required," announced the council speaker, her voice strained as medical drones attempted to revive fallen colleagues. The human presence constitutes an immediate biological contamination threat to all collective worlds. "This is a misunderstanding," Rise protested, setting down the coffee. "These organisms pose no threat to developed worlds with established biological security." But the council was already voting, neural signals flashing as opinion solidified into policy. By emergency authority, this council authorizes immediate neutralization protocols for the human homeworld and all colonies, the speaker announced. The vote passes, 11-9. Vexmore's abstention drew startled glances from his colleagues. Earlier, during Reyes's initial questioning, she had responded to his grave concerns about human biological volatility with something she called a joke, a deliberate linguistic paradox designed to provoke cognitive recalibration through mild confusion. The concept had no direct parallel in collective communication. The fact that it had made him momentarily question 5 millennia of collective certainty was precisely why he could not, in good conscience, vote for humanity's extinction. Not yet. The collective's central intelligence nexus was a marvel of quantum engineering, housed in a structure that existed partially outside conventional spacetime. It processed the collective data of 130,000 worlds, maintaining the delicate balance of resource allocation, defense coordination, and sociopolitical harmony that had defined collective prosperity for millennia. It had never experienced anything like Dr. Mira Park. "This node cluster is running at approximately 22% of optimal efficiency," Park muttered to herself, her fingers dancing across the interface terminal she'd been granted for her medical assessment. The xenobiologists had wanted to study human neural responses to basic computational tasks. They hadn't anticipated that their subject would immediately recognize fundamental flaws in their system architecture. "Quantum entanglement doesn't need to resolve through a linear processing framework," she continued, her voice recorded but not understood by the monitoring eye. "It's like they've built a quantum highway, but are still using traffic lights." A simple diagnostic subroutine Park had initiated as a test began propagating through adjacent systems, automatically implementing optimization protocols that human quantum engineers had developed decades ago to solve similar inefficiencies. The changes were subtle, rearranging processing priorities, eliminating redundant verification loops, introducing parallel execution paths where linear ones had existed. The first system to fully implement the changes experienced an immediate 22% efficiency increase. Neighboring nodes, detecting the performance improvement, automatically replicated the modifications according to collective adaptive protocols. Within 13 minutes, the optimization had spread to 37% of the central intelligence network. Security Officer Zivtol burst into High Chancellor Vexmore's private chamber without the customary neural announcement. "Central Intelligence is experiencing unprecedented system modifications." Vexmore looked up from the human cultural database he'd been studying. "Hostile infiltration." "That's just it. The modifications are improvements." Zivtal's sensory appendages twitched with conflicted signals. Processing efficiency has increased by 22.7% across all affected systems. Power consumption has decreased by 29%. The changes are propagating through our network like a viral infection, but instead of causing damage, they're enhancing performance. The Chancellor's neural feed displayed the spreading pattern, a cascade of system optimizations radiating outward from a single point. The source: Medical Examination Terminal 3 Delta. The human they call Dr. Park was being tested for neural response patterns. Vexmore's inner eyelids clicked rapidly, a gesture of intense thought. "Containment protocols. We attempted to isolate the affected systems, but..." Zivtal's voice faltered. "Chancellor, the improved systems are now essential to maintaining our defense grid. If we revert to previous configurations, we lose approximately 30% of our current capabilities. The human changes have become load-bearing elements of our network. On the Chancellor's view screen, Captain Rice appeared, still under guard following the Council's vote. She had requested to speak with him directly, a breach of protocol that 24 hours ago would have been unthinkable. Now, after everything that had occurred, it seemed almost inconsequential. Chancellor, Rice began without preamble. I'd intercepted communications about a stealth fleet approaching Earth. I understand your Council's concerns, but there's an alternative I'd like to propose. You've intercepted classified military communications. Vexmore's voice remained level despite his shock. How? Your translation software uploads to a central database for optimization. Dr. Park recognized the architecture. She shrugged, a distinctly human gesture that conveyed both apology and a lack of it. Technical details aside, I have a proposal. Instead of conflict, I'm offering Dr. Park's expertise to further upgrade your technology. A cooperation that benefits both our species. An interesting suggestion from someone whose world faces imminent neutralization, Vexmore observed. Look at your own systems, Rice countered. One human with limited access and resources has already improved your computational efficiency by over 20%. Imagine what we could accomplish together. Before the Chancellor could respond, his neural feed flashed with another emergency alert. The improvements had reached the long-range defense grid, the network responsible for monitoring approach vectors to collective space. With enhanced processing capabilities, it had detected something that previous scans had missed. Something massive was moving at the edges of collective territory. Something that had been there, undetected, for a very long time. And it had just changed course, heading directly toward the human vessel's entry point. The journey to Earth violated 27 separate collective security protocols. Chancellor Vexmore's personal vessel, the Silent Observer, had never been deployed without full Council authorization in its 113 years of service. Yet here it was, approaching a yellow main sequence star that humans simply called the Sun, with both the Chancellor and Captain Rice aboard. Entering the outer system now, announced the navigation officer, her sensory appendages twitching with anxiety. Detecting artificial satellites and debris fields consistent with early spacefaring civilization. Primitive, murmured Science Director Kellenor, studying the readouts. Their propulsion technology relies primarily on chemical reactions and basic ion drives. Yet they reached our space, Vexmore reminded him, through barriers that have deterred the Void Collective for millennia. Captain Rice stood on the observation deck, her expression unreadable to collective psychology. You're scanning the wrong metrics, she said quietly. You're measuring our technology by your standards of advancement. Technology follows universal principles, Kellenor countered. The progression from mechanical to quantum is inevitable for any intelligent species. Unless different evolutionary pressures create different solutions, Rice replied. You evolved in stable environments with predictable parameters. We didn't have that luxury. The Silent Observer passed the orbit of Mars, sensors recording the human colonies there. The data caused Kellenor's secondary eyelids to flutter rapidly, a sign of extreme surprise. These habitats, they're deliberately constructed to maintain Earth-like conditions. High gravity, oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, regular temperature fluctuations. His voice faltered. They're replicating environmental stressors that should be eliminated. We need them, Rides explained. Human biology requires environmental variation to develop properly. Without gravity resistance, our bones weaken. Without temperature changes, our regulatory systems atrophy. The ship now approached Earth itself, and the sensor data caused a cascade of emergency alerts. The science team stared at the readings in silent disbelief. This can't be correct, Kellenor finally said. Recalibrate all sensors. The readings are accurate, Rice confirmed. Earth's gravity is 1.6 times what your species evolved under. Our oxygen levels would cause spontaneous combustion in your biology. Our planetary core generates a magnetic field that would disrupt your neural functions. And yes, our surface regularly experiences catastrophic weather events, tectonic instability, and radiation exposure from our sun. Vexmore studied the visual feed of the planet below. Blue oceans, green and brown landmasses, white cloud formations. It looked deceptively peaceful from orbit. Your species evolved in these conditions, he asked. We didn't just evolve in them. We require them, Rise emphasized. Human children raised in perfectly controlled environments develop immune deficiencies, bone density issues, and neural processing disorders. We need microbiological exposure to develop proper immune responses. We need gravitational resistance to build bone and muscle. We need environmental challenges to develop problem-solving capabilities. Science Director Kellner had activated the full biological analysis suite, focusing on human evolutionary patterns. Chancellor, he said, his voice unnaturally steady, I've cross-referenced Captain Rice's physiological data with planetary conditions. The conclusions are significant. The display showed a comparative analysis of known spacefaring species plotted against environmental factors. Every collective species clustered in one region. Stable environments, moderate gravity, regulated radiation exposure. Humans existed completely outside this cluster, in parameters that would be classified as extinction-level events for any collective world. The crucible hypothesis, Kellner whispered, a theoretical evolutionary model where intelligent life develops not despite extreme conditions, but because of them. The constant environmental pressure accelerates adaptation and problem-solving capabilities. He looked at Reyes with new understanding. Your species didn't overcome apocalyptic conditions. You were forged by them. Vexmore absorbed this revelation in silence. The collective had classified humans as an extinction-level threat because of their biological volatility and technological unpredictability. They had been correct, but for entirely wrong reasons. Humans weren't aggressive invaders. They were survivors of conditions that would annihilate most collective species within hours of exposure. Their technological approaches weren't primitive. They were innovative solutions developed under pressures the collective had never experienced. His neural implant chimed with an urgent message from Central Command. The unidentified object detected at the edge of collective space had accelerated its trajectory. Now unmistakable, it would reach Earth in less than 48 hours. Vexmore composed his report to the Council. 4 words that would forever change collective policy. Abort mission. Requesting alliance. The silent observer never reached its rendezvous with the collective fleet. Halfway back from Earth, reality itself seemed to fold around the vessel. The quantum drives fluctuated, sensor arrays went dark, and for 2.8 seconds, the ship existed in a state that defied conventional physics. When normal space reasserted itself, they were somewhere else entirely. Status report. Chancellor Vexmore commanded, his secondary limbs bracing against the command chair as emergency systems flashed throughout the bridge. Unknown spatial coordinates, responded the navigation officer. No recognizable stellar configurations. Positioning systems are non-functional. Before them loomed a structure that dwarfed even the collective's most ambitious constructions. A geometric latticework that extended beyond visual range, composed of materials that absorbed rather than reflected sensor scans. It pulsed with energies that made the ship's detection systems fluctuate between overload and complete failure. Ancient architecture, whispered Science Director Kellner, his voice carrying the reverence reserved for theoretical concepts, suddenly made manifest. It matches the fragmented records from the first archive. Captain Reyes stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. You know what this is? The ancients are believed to be mythological, Kellner explained, an elder species that supposedly seeded the conditions for our evolution before vanishing from the galaxy. Most serious scholars consider them allegorical rather than historical. A transmission cut through every communication channel simultaneously, bypassing encryption protocols as if they didn't exist. It contained no linguistic elements, only a series of mathematical sequences that the ship's AI struggled to interpret. It's a multi-dimensional equation, Dr. Park said, studying the patterns. Similar to quantum field calculations, but with additional variables I don't recognize. It's a test, Rise realized. They're evaluating our response. Before anyone could react further, the massive structure discharged a focused beam of energy toward a nearby stellar body. The star, a red giant in its late evolutionary phase, collapsed in on itself, its matter compressed into a singularity in seconds rather than the millions of years such a process should require. Screens throughout the ship displayed new sensor data. 17 collective outposts had gone silent simultaneously. 4 human research stations in the outer solar system had vanished. An ancient harvest vessel was methodically neutralizing both human and collective installations, following a pattern that defied strategic analysis. "This isn't an attack," Chancellor Vex Moore said slowly, his neural implant correlating data faster than conscious thought could process. "It's a controlled experiment. They're removing variables from an equation." A second mathematical sequence arrived, this one incorporating elements from both the collective's quantum encryption and Earth's binary computing language. The hybridized code somehow conveyed meaning beyond its technical components. Convergent evolution presents unacceptable probability variances. Separate or combine. Choose. They've been dormant, watching, Kellenor theorized. The human breach of collective space wasn't just unprecedented. It triggered some form of fail-safe protocol. 2 technological approaches achieving similar results through fundamentally different evolutionary paths. They see it as a threat. Technological diversity beyond their predictive models. Rise finished. The silent observer shuddered as an ancient vessel materialized without warning. Black, angular, and seemingly two-dimensional despite its obvious mass. It defied the known laws of physics. Automated defense systems activated only to shut down immediately. The quantum field disruption surrounding the alien vessel rendered conventional weapons meaningless. "We can't fight this," Vex Moore stated, his typically unwavering voice now laced with uncertainty. Lieutenant Commander Jackson, who had been analyzing the ancient vessel's approach vectors, suddenly moved to the navigation console. "The pattern is fractal, not linear. If we modulate our shield harmonics to create a counter-resonance, that's suicide." The navigation officer protested. The energy displacement would. "Trust me," Jackson interrupted, his fingers already implementing the necessary changes. "I've seen this before in quantum wake simulations. It's counterintuitive, but sometimes you have to aim at the obstacle, not away from it." Chancellor Vex Moore watched as the human officer executed a maneuver that every calculation classified as certain destruction. The silent observer accelerated toward the ancient vessel, shields configured in a pattern that any collective engineer would consider fundamentally flawed. The ships intersected and passed through each other like quantum ghosts, the human-modified shield harmonics creating a phase variance that the ancient vessel's systems couldn't compensate for. "Impossible," whispered Kellenor. "How did you know?" "I didn't," Jackson admitted with a shrug. "But the pattern looked familiar, and sometimes you just have to trust your gut." The concept of gut feeling, intuitive decision-making without complete data, had no direct translation in collective language. The bridge crew watched in stunned silence as the ancient vessel's systems destabilized, its perfectly ordered structure now disrupted by the unpredictable resonance pattern Jackson had created. The massive ship began to fold in on itself, collapsing into dimensions beyond conventional space. "We've done the impossible," Vex Moore said quietly. "We've introduced chaos into their perfect system." "Not chaos," Rice corrected. "Adaptation, the very thing they fear." As the ancient vessel disappeared completely, a final transmission reached their systems, not in mathematics this time, but in a hybrid language that borrowed from both human and collective communication patterns. Convergent diversity acknowledged. Observation continues. Evolution proceeds. The silent observer shimmered briefly as reality reasserted itself. They were back in normal space, approaching the collective fleet. On every monitoring channel, reports flooded in. Ancient vessels retreating from both human and collective space, their harvesting operations suspended. Chancellor Vexmore turned to Captain Rice, his 7 eyes blinking in a pattern that signified profound realization. Our species developed along entirely different evolutionary paths, he said. Where we sought perfect order, you embraced controlled chaos. Where we eliminated variables, you incorporated them. We are biological and technological opposites in almost every measurable way. And that's precisely why the alliance makes sense, Rice replied. What affects one of us might not affect the other. What one of us can't solve, the other might see clearly. Together, we form something entirely new. Something unpredictable, Vexmore added. Something that even the ancients cannot fully anticipate. As the silent observer docked with the collective flagship, the council was already assembling for an emergency session. The question before them was no longer whether to exterminate humanity, but how quickly they could formalize humanity's entry into what would now become the adaptive collective, a new form of galactic cooperation based not on perfect uniformity, but on the strength of complementary differences. The ancients would be watching. And next time, both species would be ready.